Hey guys, tonight we explore a question that sounds surprisingly modern. Could people in the Middle Ages have had autism? So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. To understand why medieval people probably included autistic individuals, we first need to forget almost everything modern society associates with diagnosis. Imagine waking up in a small English village around the year 1300. There are no psychologists, no neurologists, no therapists, and certainly no online quizzes asking whether your habit of organising spoons by size means something profound. If a child behaves differently from others, nobody reaches for a medical textbook. Most villages possess exactly 0 medical textbooks, and the local healer is currently busy trying to determine whether onions can cure 3 completely unrelated illnesses. Instead, people ask different questions. Is the child blessed? Is the child unusual? Is the child destined for great things? Has God given them a special purpose? Or, depending on who is doing the talking, has a fairy stolen the real child and replaced them with another? That last explanation sounds absurd today, but it made perfect sense to many medieval people. Remember, this was an age when comets could be warnings from heaven, bad weather might signal divine displeasure, and a chicken behaving strangely could probably start a village rumour that lasted 6 months. The important thing to remember is that autism did not suddenly appear in the 20th century when doctors began describing it. Human beings have remained remarkably similar for thousands of years. The medieval world contained the same variety of minds that exist today. Some children were loud and sociable, some were quiet and withdrawn, some enjoyed festivals, crowded markets, and endless conversations. Others would probably have preferred everyone stop talking for 5 minutes, or forever. Some people developed intense interests that consumed enormous portions of their lives. One person might memorize every local family lineage. Another might spend years studying herbs. A monk might devote decades to copying manuscripts with microscopic precision. A scholar might become fascinated by a theological question so specific that even other scholars wished he would please discuss literally anything else. Medieval records are filled with people who stood out from their communities. Chroniclers wrote about individuals who avoided social interaction, preferred solitude, spoke very little, disliked certain environments, or became extraordinarily focused on particular subjects. Of course, none of this allows us to diagnose anyone. Historians cannot travel back in time, conduct assessments, and return with neatly completed paperwork. If they could, they would probably spend most of their time settling arguments at academic conferences. What we do have are descriptions, lots of descriptions. And when those descriptions are viewed through a modern lens, some begin to sound surprisingly familiar. The challenge is that medieval writers lacked the vocabulary we possess today. They could observe behavior, but they could not categorize it using modern medical language. Instead, they described what they saw: the unusually quiet child, the obsessive scholar, the solitary monk, the craftsman who seemed happiest repeating the same task thousands of times. As we move deeper into the Middle Ages, we'll discover that these people appear far more often than you might expect. Hidden among kings, peasants, monks, merchants, and craftsmen are countless individuals whose lives suggest that neurological diversity is not a modern phenomenon at all. It may simply be one of the oldest human stories ever told. If you were an autistic child growing up in a medieval village, nobody would know it, not because your behavior would go unnoticed. Quite the opposite. Medieval communities were small, close-knit places where everyone knew everyone else's business. If you sneezed unusually, there was a reasonable chance 3 neighbours would discuss it before sunset. Privacy was not a medieval strength. Most villages contained only a few hundred people at most. Families lived close together, worked together, worshipped together, and often spent their entire lives within a few miles of where they were born. In such an environment, differences stood out quickly. A child who preferred solitude would be noticed. A A child who spoke less than others would be noticed. A child who became intensely interested in a particular subject would definitely be noticed, especially if that subject happened to be something unusual. Imagine a boy who spends every spare moment watching birds instead of playing games with other children. He learns their migration patterns, nesting habits, and feeding behaviors. Years pass, and he still finds birds more interesting than most conversations. Today, some parents might wonder whether their child is neurodivergent. In the Middle Ages, people would probably conclude that he was simply the bird boy. And honestly, medieval nicknames were often far less flattering. Likewise, imagine a girl fascinated by weaving patterns. While other children run through fields chasing each other, she spends hours studying cloth, counting threads, and memorizing designs. Adults might see her as unusually gifted, unusually strange, or both simultaneously. The Middle Ages were surprisingly comfortable with that contradiction. A person could be admired and considered odd at exactly the same time. Many medieval children never attended school, which meant they were not constantly compared against standardized expectations. There were no report cards, no developmental checklists, and no teachers writing notes home about classroom participation. This could sometimes be an advantage. A child who struggled socially but excelled at practical skills might simply be directed toward an occupation that suited them. Medieval society cared far more about whether you could contribute than whether you fit neatly into a behavioral category. Of course, this was not always kind. Children who seemed different could face teasing, exclusion, or suspicion. Human beings have unfortunately remained remarkably consistent in their ability to notice anyone who does not perfectly match the group. Some things never change. Yet medieval communities could also be surprisingly accepting when someone's differences came with useful talents. And that brings us to one of the most fascinating aspects of medieval life. A world where unusual minds sometimes found unexpected places to thrive. For a medieval person, religion was not something you did once a week. Religion was the framework through which almost everything was understood. The seasons, illnesses, wars, harvests, dreams, strange behavior, and unexpected events all fit into a universe governed by God. If someone acted differently from everyone else, the first explanation was rarely medical. It was spiritual. This created a fascinating situation for people who might today be recognized as autistic. Imagine a young man who dislikes crowded gatherings. He avoids village festivals, struggles with small talk, and prefers spending hours alone reading scripture or contemplating religious questions. In a modern setting, some people might see social difficulties. In the Middle Ages, others might see holiness. After all, many respected saints were not exactly known for their sparkling conversational skills. Throughout medieval Europe, stories circulated about holy men and women who preferred solitude, spoke very little, and devoted themselves obsessively to prayer. Some withdrew from society almost entirely. Others spent years focusing on a single spiritual pursuit with remarkable intensity. To medieval observers, such behavior could appear admirable rather than unusual. A monk who spent 10 hours a day studying sacred texts was disciplined. A saint who isolated himself in the wilderness was devoted. A hermit who avoided social gatherings was spiritually focused. Nobody was asking whether these individuals experienced social interactions differently. They were asking whether God had chosen them for a special purpose. Of course, not every difference received such positive interpretations. The medieval world could be generous one moment and deeply suspicious the next. If a person's unusual behavior fit accepted religious expectations, they might be praised. If it did not, people became nervous. A woman who spent hours speaking about visions might be regarded as blessed or dangerous. Sometimes the difference between those two judgments depended entirely on who happened to be listening. Medieval society had a remarkable talent for reaching completely opposite conclusions using the same evidence. This uncertainty meant that people who behaved differently often lived in a complicated social space. They might be respected by some neighbours and viewed with concern by others. Yet, Religion also provided something modern observers sometimes overlook. It gave unusual individuals a role. A person who seemed different could become a monk, a nun, a hermit, a scholar, or a religious devotee. Their intense focus, preference for routine, and comfort with solitude could actually fit certain religious lifestyles remarkably well. And nowhere was this more obvious than inside the monasteries of medieval Europe, where some men spent entire lifetimes pursuing a single passion with a level of concentration that would leave most modern office workers exhausted before lunchtime. For most medieval children, life was centered around one institution above all others: the family. Not school, not government, not social services, certainly not a team of specialists holding meetings about developmental milestones. The family was responsible for nearly everything: food, shelter, education, discipline, work training, and survival all happened under the same roof, assuming your roof wasn't currently leaking, which in medieval Europe was often an optimistic assumption. This meant that a child who behaved differently was usually understood first and foremost by their relatives. Parents quickly learned which children enjoyed company and which preferred solitude. They learned which children followed routines with almost military precision, and which ones seemed incapable of finding their shoes 2 days in a row. Some children spoke constantly, others barely spoke at all. Most families adapted as best they could. Contrary to popular stereotypes, medieval parents generally cared deeply about their children. Life was harsh, but affection was not absent. Surviving letters, household records, and personal accounts reveal parents worrying, grieving, teaching, encouraging, and sometimes becoming utterly confused by their offspring. In other words, they were parents. Imagine a boy who becomes distressed whenever his daily routine changes. He wants meals at predictable times. He performs chores in the same order every day. He dislikes unexpected visitors. When travelers arrive without warning, everyone else is excited to hear news from distant lands. The boy is mainly annoyed because somebody is sitting in his usual spot. His family might never understand exactly why he reacts this way, but they would notice. Over time, they would often make adjustments. Many medieval households were practical rather than theoretical. They cared less about explaining behavior and more about managing it. If something worked, they kept doing it. If allowing a child to complete chores in a certain order prevented arguments, that became the routine. No lengthy debate required. Meanwhile, children with intense interests could sometimes become valuable family assets. A child fascinated by animals might become skilled with livestock. A child obsessed with counting and record-keeping might prove useful for managing accounts. A child who spent hours examining tools could eventually become a capable craftsman. The family often became the bridge between unusual traits and productive adulthood. Of course, not every family was patient or understanding. Some children undoubtedly faced criticism, punishment, or ridicule for behaviors nobody understood. But many others found something surprisingly important: acceptance. Not because people understood neurological differences, but because families often learned an eternal truth that transcends every century. When you love someone long enough, their peculiarities stop being peculiar. They simply become part of who that person is. And in medieval Europe, some of those children eventually grew into adults whose extraordinary focus would make them indispensable members of their communities. One of the biggest differences between the medieval world and the modern one was that intense interests were often not seen as hobbies. They were jobs. Today, if someone spends 8 hours researching the history of door hinges, their friends may have questions. In the Middle Ages, there was a decent chance that person eventually became the village blacksmith and made a respectable living from their unusual enthusiasm. This mattered because medieval society was built around specialization. Every community depended on people mastering highly specific skills. There were millers, masons, carpenters, scribes, weavers, armourers, bell makers, parchment makers, and countless other trades that required patience and repetition. Lots and lots of repetition. The romantic image of medieval life often involves adventure and excitement. But the reality was that many jobs consisted of performing the same task thousands of times. A stonemason might spend years carving nearly identical blocks. A blacksmith could make endless nails. A weaver might repeat the same movements hour after hour. A scribe could spend entire days copying words onto parchment. For many people, this was exhausting. For others, it may have been deeply satisfying. Imagine a young apprentice fascinated by patterns. While his friends dream of tournaments and heroic adventures, he becomes captivated by the geometry of cathedral construction. He studies arches, measurements, and stonework with relentless dedication. Years later, he might become a master builder. The villagers see expertise. Modern observers might also recognize something else, an extraordinary level of focus. Medieval records frequently mention individuals who became known for a single skill. Entire reputations were built upon mastery of one narrow area of knowledge. Some craftsmen could identify dozens of wood types by touch alone. Some scribes memorized enormous sections of religious texts. Some metalworkers spent decades perfecting techniques that outsiders barely noticed. These people were often respected precisely because of their intense interests. In fact, medieval society sometimes rewarded behavior that modern schools or workplaces might find unusual. A person who became completely absorbed in one subject could gain status, wealth, or influence if that subject happened to be useful. Of course, there were limits. If your obsession involved counting raindrops or following chickens around the village while taking notes, your career options remained somewhat restricted. Still, the broader pattern is clear. The Middle Ages created spaces where intense focus could become valuable rather than problematic. And nowhere was this more obvious than inside the monasteries, where some individuals devoted entire lifetimes to a single subject with a level of concentration that bordered on the astonishing. If there was one place in medieval Europe where an intensely focused person could thrive, it was a monastery. To modern eyes, monasteries can seem quiet, peaceful, and perhaps a little repetitive. To many medieval monks, that was not a drawback. That was the entire point. A monastery offered something increasingly rare in the chaotic medieval world: routine. The day followed a schedule. Prayers occurred at fixed hours. Meals happened at fixed times. Work had clearly defined expectations. The bells rang according to a predictable pattern. Life was structured, ordered, and remarkably consistent. For some people, this was comforting. For others, it was heaven with slightly fewer cushions. A medieval monk might wake before dawn, attend prayers, study scripture, copy manuscripts, perform assigned duties, and repeat the process day after day, year after year. To an outsider, such a life could seem monotonous. To someone who enjoyed routine and deep concentration, it could be incredibly satisfying. Monasteries were also centers of learning. Books were precious and rare, so monks often spent years studying the same texts repeatedly. Many developed astonishing memories. Some could recite enormous portions of scripture from memory. Others mastered complex theological arguments that filled entire volumes. A few became experts in subjects so specialized that even their fellow monks struggled to understand why anyone cared. History is full of scholars who spent decades arguing over details that would make modern people quietly close the book and walk away. One medieval debate concerned the exact nature of angels. Another involved intricate questions about divine knowledge and free will. These discussions could continue for years, and remarkably, participants enjoyed them. Many monks displayed a level of focus that modern observers would immediately recognize as unusual. They dedicated entire lifetimes to cataloguing information, preserving texts, and perfecting tiny details that most people overlooked. Consider the manuscript copyists. A single book could require months or even years to reproduce. Every letter had to be carefully written by hand. Every mistake mattered. Every page demanded concentration. Most people would find this unbearable after a few days. Yet some monks devoted decades to it. Their work preserved countless ancient texts that would otherwise have disappeared forever. Of course, we cannot know what was happening inside their minds, but we can observe the behavior. the preference for routine, the comfort found in predictable schedules, the intense focus on specific interests, the willingness to spend extraordinary amounts of time mastering a narrow field of knowledge. These traits appear again and again within medieval monasteries. And the more we look, the more it becomes clear that some of history's greatest preservers of knowledge may have succeeded precisely because their minds worked a little differently from everyone else's. While monks preserved knowledge inside monastery walls, craftsmen preserved something equally important outside them: skill. And medieval craftsmanship often demanded a level of precision that bordered on obsession. Consider the cathedral builders. A massive cathedral was not constructed in a few years. Some took decades. Others took more than a century. Generations of workers contributed to projects they would never live to see completed. Imagine dedicating your entire career to a building whose grand opening would be attended by your great-grandchildren. Talk about delayed gratification. Yet thousands of craftsmen did exactly that. Stonecutters spent years carving blocks to exact specifications. Carpenters shaped beams with astonishing accuracy. Glaziers assembled intricate stained glass windows composed of hundreds of tiny pieces. Every task required attention to detail. Every mistake could be expensive. And every successful project rewarded patience. Many medieval trades naturally attracted people who enjoyed systems, patterns, and repetition. A blacksmith learned how different metals behaved under specific conditions. A weaver memorized countless thread combinations. A clockmaker, later in the medieval period, worked with intricate mechanisms that required extraordinary precision. These occupations rewarded intense focus. In fact, many master craftsmen became known for their perfectionism. Some developed reputations for inspecting their own work repeatedly before allowing it to leave the workshop. Others spent far longer on projects than customers expected because they refused to accept anything less than their personal standards. This could be frustrating for everyone involved. The customer wanted the item. The craftsman wanted it to be correct. History suggests the craftsman usually won. Medieval guild records occasionally mention apprentices who struggled because they lacked patience, discipline, or attention to detail. Yet they also reveal masters who devoted enormous energy to perfecting their craft. The difference between an ordinary sword and an exceptional one might come down to tiny details invisible to most people. The same was true for furniture, textiles, manuscripts, jewellery, and architecture. Many craftsmen noticed things that others simply did not. A slightly uneven line, a minor flaw in the metal, an irregular stitch, a measurement that was off by the width of a fingernail. To most people, these imperfections barely existed. To the craftsman, they were impossible to ignore. Again, none of this proves autism. Plenty of highly skilled people are not autistic. But when historians examine medieval society, certain patterns appear repeatedly. Individuals who thrive on routine, focus intensely on specific interests, notice details others miss, and willingly dedicate years to mastering a single skill. The workshop, much like the monastery, provided an environment where those traits could become strengths rather than obstacles. And in many cases, those strengths helped build the medieval world itself. One of the most common traits associated with autism today is a preference for routine. Not everyone experiences it in the same way, of course, but many autistic people find comfort in predictability. Knowing what comes next can make the world feel more manageable, less chaotic, and far easier to navigate. As it happens, medieval society was practically built on routine. This was not because medieval people had discovered some advanced psychological insight. It was because clocks were rare, life was difficult, and nobody wanted to accidentally starve. The average peasant's year followed a pattern that changed very little from one generation to the next. Crops were planted at specific times. Harvests occurred at specific times. Religious festivals followed the church calendar. Work began at sunrise and ended when daylight disappeared. Even the seasons dictated behaviour. Spring meant planting, summer meant labour, autumn meant harvest, winter meant surviving, and then the entire process started again. Predictability was not merely comforting, it was essential. For someone who preferred structure, this environment may have felt surprisingly natural. A medieval farmer often performed the same tasks every day: feed the animals, check the fields, repair equipment, gather supplies, repeat. Tomorrow would look remarkably similar. So would next week, and probably next year. Even monasteries operated according to strict schedules. Bells announced prayers, meals, work periods, and rest. Monks could often predict exactly what they would be doing at any given hour. Frankly, some monasteries were so structured that modern corporate managers would probably take notes. This predictability helped maintain order in a world full of uncertainty, but it also meant that people who preferred routine did not necessarily stand out. Many behaviors that might seem unusual in a modern, fast-changing society blended naturally into medieval life. A person who insisted on performing tasks in the same order every day might simply be viewed as disciplined. Someone who became upset when routines changed could be seen as stubborn. Someone who carefully followed established customs might even earn respect. After all, medieval culture valued tradition. The phrase, "we've always done it this way," carried tremendous authority. Entire communities organized their lives around inherited habits. The downside, however, was that unexpected changes could be deeply disruptive. Wars, famines, plagues, and poor harvests could suddenly destroy the routines people depended upon. And for individuals who relied heavily on predictability, such disruptions may have been particularly difficult. Yet when life remained stable, medieval society offered something that many modern environments do not. A world where routine was not unusual. It was simply life. And for some people, that may have made the Middle Ages feel far less overwhelming than we often imagine. One challenge that many autistic people face today involves something most people never consciously think about: unwritten social rules. The strange thing about social rules is that nobody actually writes them down. There is no handbook, no official training course, no village elder standing in the town square announcing, "Good morning, everyone. Today's lesson is how long eye contact should last before things become uncomfortable." People are simply expected to know, and medieval society was absolutely overflowing with unwritten rules. In fact, medieval life may have contained even more social expectations than modern life. Every interaction had invisible layers. You had to know how to address a noble, how to greet a priest, how to behave at a feast, how much respect to show an elder, when to speak, when to remain silent, when to laugh, and perhaps most importantly, when not to laugh, particularly when the Lord was involved. The average peasant could probably survive a poor joke. Mocking the local lord was a considerably riskier experiment. These social customs were rarely explained in detail because most people learned them naturally through observation. Children spent years watching adults and gradually absorbed the expectations around them. But not everyone learns social behavior in exactly the same way. Medieval records occasionally describe individuals who seemed awkward, overly direct, or unaware of social conventions. Chroniclers often portrayed them as eccentric, strange, or lacking proper manners. Sometimes these descriptions sound remarkably familiar. A person speaks bluntly when diplomacy is expected. Someone becomes so focused on a topic that they continue discussing it long after everyone else has lost interest. Another individual misses subtle hints that seem obvious to others. None of these behaviors automatically indicate autism, but they do illustrate the kinds of social difficulties that have existed throughout human history. What's fascinating is that medieval society often tolerated these traits if the individual possessed valuable skills. A brilliant scholar might be forgiven for being socially awkward. A talented craftsman could be excused for being eccentric. A respected monk might be allowed certain peculiarities. People would simply shrug and say something equivalent to, "That's just how he is." Not exactly a clinical assessment, but surprisingly effective. Of course, this tolerance had limits. Someone who repeatedly violated important social expectations could find themselves isolated or criticized. The medieval world was not endlessly patient. Still, it recognized something that modern societies occasionally forget. Human beings are complicated. Some are charming, some are awkward, some effortlessly understand social situations. Others never quite figure them out. And those differences existed long before psychology gave them names. They were simply part of the rich, sometimes confusing, and often very human fabric of medieval life. If there was one medieval profession perfectly designed for a person with an intense interest in a very specific subject, it was scholarship. The medieval scholar lived in a world where knowledge was rare, books were expensive, and becoming an expert often required years of dedication, or, in some cases, decades. Imagine spending 15 years studying a single topic. Now imagine doing it without search engines, online libraries, or the ability to ask strangers on the internet for answers. Suddenly the Middle Ages begins to look less romantic and more like an endurance test. Yet some scholars thrived in exactly these conditions. Medieval universities, which began appearing across Europe from the 12th century onward, attracted individuals who were willing to devote extraordinary amounts of time to learning. Students and teachers spent years examining theology, law, medicine, philosophy, and mathematics. Many became completely absorbed in their subjects, and sometimes completely detached from everything else. Contemporary accounts occasionally describe scholars who seemed absent-minded, socially awkward, or oblivious to ordinary concerns. These men could discuss complex theological arguments for hours, while forgetting practical matters entirely. A scholar might remember hundreds of passages from ancient texts, but forget where he left his shoes. To be fair, modern academics have not entirely escaped this tradition. Some things transcend the centuries. One famous medieval stereotype involved the absent-minded professor. Students joked about teachers so immersed in thought that they appeared disconnected from the world around them. Stories circulated about scholars walking into walls, forgetting meals, or becoming lost while contemplating philosophical problems. Whether every story was true is another matter. People have always enjoyed exaggerating the eccentricities of intellectuals. Still, the stereotype existed for a reason. Many scholars displayed remarkable levels of concentration. They could spend hours, days, or even years pursuing answers to questions that most people never considered. Questions such as, what is the exact relationship between faith and reason? Can divine knowledge coexist with free will? How should ancient texts be interpreted? And, occasionally, questions so obscure that even other scholars wondered whether everyone involved needed a hobby. The point is not that medieval scholars were autistic. Most were not. The point is that medieval society created environments where people with intense intellectual interests could flourish. A person who became fascinated by a narrow subject might find respect rather than ridicule. Their focus became an asset. Their persistence became a strength. Their obsession became expertise. And in many cases, those experts helped preserve and expand human knowledge, leaving behind ideas that still influence the world today. Proof that sometimes the people who seem a little different are the very ones who push society forward. For many medieval people, spending too much time alone was suspicious. For others, it was holy. This strange contradiction created one of the most fascinating spaces in medieval society for people who may have preferred solitude. The world of saints, hermits, and religious recluses. Today, if someone announced they were moving into a tiny hut in the wilderness to avoid most human interaction, their family would probably have questions. Many questions. Medieval people did too. But they also had a category for such individuals. They called them holy. Throughout Europe, thousands of men and women chose lives of extreme solitude. Some lived in forests. Others settled in caves. A few occupied tiny cells attached to churches where they spent years praying, studying, and interacting with only a handful of visitors. These people were known as hermits, anchorites, or recluses, and surprisingly often, society admired them. The most famous examples became local celebrities. Pilgrims travelled long distances to seek their advice. Nobles asked for their prayers. Kings occasionally consulted them on important matters. Imagine becoming so respected that rulers travel for days to hear your opinion. Now imagine achieving that specifically by avoiding people. That is a career path unique to the Middle Ages. Many hermits described finding peace in silence. They preferred predictable routines, long periods of contemplation, and freedom from the social demands of ordinary life. Again, this does not mean they were autistic. Many people simply enjoy solitude. But what matters is that medieval society created an accepted role for individuals who did not fit comfortably into highly social environments. A person who disliked crowds might become a hermit. A person fascinated by scripture could devote years to studying it. A person who found social interaction exhausting might discover that a religious life offered a socially acceptable way to limit it. Not everyone approved, of course. Some critics argued that certain hermits were simply eccentric people hiding from society. Others suspected that a few enjoyed the reputation more than the spiritual discipline. Human nature remains wonderfully consistent. Even in the Middle Ages, people debated whether someone was genuinely holy or merely unusual. Yet many solitary religious figures earned widespread respect because their isolation produced visible results. They became scholars, counselors, writers, and spiritual authorities. In a society that often demanded conformity, these individuals found a surprising degree of freedom, and their stories remind us of something important. Throughout history, some people have always felt most comfortable on the edges of society, not because they hated humanity, but because they simply experienced the world differently from those around them. By now, a pattern is beginning to emerge. Throughout medieval society, certain environments seem to have rewarded traits that modern people often associate with autism: intense focus, attention to detail, comfort with routine, and deep interest in specialized subjects. This does not mean medieval employers were actively searching for neurodivergent workers. The average lord was not conducting personality assessments before hiring a blacksmith. Most were simply hoping the horseshoes stayed attached to the horses. Yet some occupations naturally suited certain kinds of minds. Take the profession of scribe. Before the invention of the printing press, books had to be copied by hand. Every letter mattered. Every page required concentration. One small mistake could ruin hours of work. For many people, this task would have been unbearable. For others, it may have been deeply satisfying. The same was true for weaving. A skilled weaver had to manage intricate patterns, monitor hundreds of threads, and maintain consistency over long periods. Tiny mistakes could disrupt an entire design. Likewise, metalworking demanded precision and patience. A blacksmith learned through endless repetition. Heat the metal, shape it, cool it, repeat, day after day. The work was physically demanding, but it was also highly structured. Many medieval trades operated according to clear systems and predictable procedures. And then there were the accountants. Yes, medieval Europe had accountants. Somebody had to keep track of rents, taxes, harvests, livestock, and payments. Monasteries, noble households, and merchants generated enormous quantities of records. Certain individuals became extraordinarily skilled at organizing information. They tracked inventories, calculated expenses, and maintained documents with a level of dedication that suggests they genuinely enjoyed it. Which is fortunate, because most people would rather wrestle a goose than spend an afternoon counting grain sacks. What makes all of this fascinating is that medieval society often judged people by results rather than personality. A craftsman might be awkward, a scholar might be eccentric, a clerk might dislike social gatherings. But if they performed their duties exceptionally well, many communities overlooked behaviours that seemed unusual. competence brought tolerance, sometimes quite a lot of tolerance. This was especially true in specialized professions where expertise was rare. A village might have many farmers. It might have only one skilled blacksmith. When someone possesses a valuable skill, society often becomes remarkably flexible about their quirks. And that flexibility allowed many unusual individuals to build successful lives. But not everyone was fortunate enough to have talents that others immediately recognized. For some medieval people, being different could attract something far less pleasant than respect. It could attract suspicion. Unfortunately, not every medieval person who behaved differently found acceptance. Some found suspicion. And in a world with limited scientific understanding, suspicion could spread remarkably fast. The medieval village was a close-knit community. Everyone knew one another's habits, routines, strengths, and weaknesses. This created a sense of belonging, but it also meant unusual behavior rarely went unnoticed. If someone acted differently, people talked. A lot. In fact, if gossip were a renewable energy source, medieval Europe might have industrialized 5 centuries early. Imagine a villager who rarely attended social gatherings. He avoids festivals. He speaks very little. He spends long periods alone. He becomes intensely interested in unusual subjects that nobody else understands. Some neighbours might simply think he is eccentric. Others might begin asking questions. Why does he keep to himself? Why doesn't he behave like everyone else? What exactly does he do all day? And once a community starts asking those questions, answers often become less important than speculation. Throughout the Middle Ages, people frequently interpreted unfamiliar behaviour through the lens of superstition, religion, or fear. Someone who behaved oddly might be described as strange. Someone who struggled socially could be considered rude. Someone who failed to follow expected customs might be viewed as suspicious. This was especially true during times of crisis. When crops failed, disease spread, or war threatened a region, communities often became less tolerant of differences. Fear has a way of narrowing people's patience. A person who seemed unusual during peaceful times might suddenly become a target of gossip during difficult ones. History repeatedly shows this pattern. When societies feel secure, they often tolerate eccentricity. When societies feel threatened, they often become suspicious of it. The Middle Ages were no exception, yet even here the reality was complicated. Many people who seemed different were still valued by their communities. The quiet blacksmith who made excellent tools might be left alone. The eccentric scholar who provided useful advice could earn respect. The solitary healer who knew valuable remedies might be tolerated despite unusual habits. Medieval people were often more practical than modern stereotypes suggest. If someone contributed something important, neighbours frequently overlooked a great deal. Still, there were limits. The individual who could not conform to basic social expectations, lacked useful status, or attracted the wrong kind of attention sometimes faced exclusion. Not because they were autistic, nobody had that concept, but because humans have always been uneasy around behaviour they do not understand. And that truth may be one of the least medieval things about the Middle Ages. It is, unfortunately, timeless. Modern discussions about autism often focus on challenges, and those challenges are real. Social difficulties, sensory sensitivities, misunderstandings, and communication barriers can all have a significant impact on a person's life. But history suggests there may be another side to the story. A side that medieval people sometimes recognized, even if they lacked the language to describe it. Because many traits associated with autism can also create remarkable strengths. Think about the individuals we've encountered so far. the monk who spent decades preserving manuscripts, the craftsman who noticed tiny flaws invisible to everyone else, the scholar who devoted years to mastering a difficult subject, the accountant who could track enormous amounts of information without losing track of details. These achievements were not possible despite their unusual traits. In many cases, they may have been possible because of them. One of the most common observations throughout history is that certain people possess an extraordinary ability to focus on subjects that genuinely interest them. While others become distracted, they keep going. While others lose patience, they keep learning. While others move on to the next thing, they continue digging deeper and deeper, and somehow even deeper. If you've ever met someone who can happily discuss medieval coin production for 3 hours without noticing that everyone else has quietly left the room, you already understand the phenomenon. The Middle Ages depended heavily on this kind of dedication. Cathedrals were not built by people who became bored after 2 weeks. Libraries were not preserved by individuals who disliked detail. Complex legal systems were not maintained by people who hated organization. Many of history's greatest accomplishments required persistence that bordered on obsession. The medieval world rewarded mastery, and mastery often required exactly the sort of intense concentration that some people naturally possessed. Of course, these strengths did not erase difficulties. A brilliant scholar could still struggle socially. A talented craftsman could still find social gatherings exhausting. An exceptional scribe could still feel out of place among their peers. Human beings have never been simple collections of strengths and weaknesses. We are mixtures of both. What makes medieval history fascinating is that it reminds us that neurological diversity is not a modern invention. The same range of minds that exists today likely existed centuries ago. Some people thought differently, learned differently, focused differently, experienced the world differently. And despite the challenges they faced, many contributed enormously to the societies around them. Which brings us to perhaps the most important question of all. If these individuals helped build the medieval world, how many other forgotten minds helped shape history without ever knowing there was a name for what made them different? As our journey through the Middle Ages comes to an end, it is worth returning to the question that started it all. Did medieval people have autism? The honest answer is almost certainly yes. But there is an important caveat. We can never know exactly who. No historian can open a manuscript from the year 1200 and discover a chapter titled "Local Carpenter Receives Formal Neurological Assessment." History is rarely that convenient. What we do possess are fragments, descriptions, observations, stories. The quiet child who preferred solitude, the monk who spent 50 years studying a single subject, the craftsman obsessed with perfection, the scholar who understood books better than people, the hermit who felt more comfortable alone than in a crowd. Again and again, medieval records introduce us to individuals whose lives sound surprisingly familiar. Not because autism is new, but because it is old, very old, as old as humanity itself. For most of history, people did not have diagnostic labels. They had personalities, reputations, and nicknames. Sometimes flattering nicknames. Sometimes nicknames that would absolutely violate modern workplace policies. A medieval villager might simply be known as the quiet one, the strange one, the clever one, the monk who never stops talking about astronomy, or perhaps the fellow who can identify every bird in the county and somehow remembers all their nesting habits. History rarely tells us how these individuals understood themselves, but it does show us something remarkable. They existed, they worked, they learned, they loved, they struggled, they succeeded, and in many cases, they left lasting marks on the world around them. This is perhaps the greatest lesson hidden within the question of medieval autism. Human diversity is not a modern phenomenon. The modern world did not invent different ways of thinking. It merely developed better language for describing them. The same variety of minds that exist today helped build cathedrals, preserve ancient knowledge, create works of art, manage kingdoms, and pass skills from one generation to the next. Some people fit comfortably into society's expectations, others never quite did. And yet both groups helped shape history. In the end, the story is not really about autism. It is about humanity, about the countless ways human beings experience the world, about how every era contains people who think differently from those around them, and about the possibility that some of the most important contributions in history came from individuals whose minds worked in ways their contemporaries could never fully understand, which means that somewhere in a medieval village, monastery, workshop, or library, there was probably someone who would feel surprisingly at home in the modern world, though they would almost certainly be horrified by email. When Marco Polo finally returned to Venice after more than 20 years in Asia, he faced a strange problem. Nobody believed he was rich. In fact, according to one famous story, some people barely believed he was Marco Polo at all. The young Venetian who had departed with his father and uncle in the year 1271 had vanished into the distant east. In his place stood a weathered man with sun-darkened skin, foreign habits, and enough stories to fill a library. He claimed to have crossed deserts larger than kingdoms, visited cities wealthier than Paris, and served at the court of the most powerful ruler on earth. To many Venetians, this sounded suspiciously like the sort of tale a sailor might invent after spending too much time near strong wine. But Marco and his family had one final surprise. According to later accounts, they hosted a grand banquet shortly after their return. The guests admired the luxurious robes worn by the Polo family. Then, during the feast, the Polos reportedly cut open the seams of their garments. Out poured rubies, sapphires, emeralds, pearls, and other precious stones hidden inside the fabric. Suddenly, the room became very quiet. Whether every detail of that story is true or not, it captures an important reality. The Polo family had returned from Asia with extraordinary wealth. They had spent years operating within the vast trading networks of the Mongol Empire, an empire that stretched from Eastern Europe to China and connected markets on a scale few Europeans could even imagine. Yet this raises an interesting question. How rich was Marco Polo really? Modern people often assume that famous travellers automatically became wealthy. History is filled with explorers who discovered incredible places but died with empty pockets. Fame and fortune rarely travel together. One pays for songs and statues, the other pays for dinner. Marco's case was different. He belonged to a successful merchant family long before the famous journey began. His father, Niccolo Polo, and his uncle Maffeo Polo were experienced traders who dealt in valuable goods and travelled farther than most Europeans ever dreamed of going. They were already prosperous men when Marco was born. The journey to Asia was not the desperate gamble of poor adventurers. It was a business venture, undertaken by merchants seeking opportunities beyond the known horizons of Europe. And when they finally returned, the evidence suggests they had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. The real mystery, however, is not whether Marco Polo was rich. It is whether a merchant from Venice could actually rival the wealth of Europe's nobles, princes, and aristocrats. That comparison would reveal just how extraordinary his fortune may have been. To understand whether Marco Polo was richer than most European nobles, we first need to meet his competition. And it was formidable competition. When people hear the word noble, they often imagine someone living in a stone castle, eating roasted meat, and occasionally ordering knights to do something dramatic. While that image is not entirely wrong, medieval wealth was far more complicated than gold coins stacked in a treasury. A nobleman's fortune was usually measured in land. Land produced everything that mattered. It generated crops, livestock, timber, taxes, rents, tolls, and military service. A lord might own dozens of villages filled with peasants who paid him portions of their harvests every year. He might control bridges where merchants paid fees to cross. He might own mills where farmers were required to grind grain for a price. The land never stopped working. Even while the noble slept, hunted deer, or attended a feast, hundreds or thousands of people were effectively generating income on his behalf. This gave aristocrats an advantage merchants rarely enjoyed. Their wealth was often stable and predictable. A bad trading season could ruin a merchant. A noble with extensive estates usually had multiple sources of income to cushion any losses. But not all nobles were equal. At the bottom were minor knights, who might own a small manor and little else. Many lived comfortably, but were hardly wealthy by modern standards. Some even struggled with debt. A fancy coat of arms did not always guarantee a full purse. Above them stood barons, counts, dukes, and powerful regional lords. These men controlled enormous territories and commanded substantial revenues. Their households could include dozens of servants, soldiers, clerks, and retainers. Then came the princes and kings. The King of France, the King of England, and other major rulers possessed resources that dwarfed those of ordinary nobles. Entire provinces contributed to their income. Their treasuries financed wars, castles, diplomatic missions, and lavish courts. Compared to these rulers, almost any merchant appeared insignificant. Or at least that was the traditional assumption. Yet the late 13th century was beginning to change the rules of wealth. Trade was expanding across Europe. Cities like Venice, Genoa, and Florence were producing businessmen whose fortunes sometimes rivaled ancient aristocratic families. Money, for perhaps the first time in centuries, was starting to challenge land. And among the merchants of Venice, few names would become more famous than Marco Polo. The question now becomes far more interesting. How much money could a successful Venetian merchant actually accumulate, and was it enough to compete with the noble class itself? So, how rich was Marco Polo himself? This is where the story becomes frustrating for historians, and fascinating for everyone else. Unlike modern billionaires, Marco Polo never published a list of his assets. There were no tax returns, no annual reports, and certainly no magazine ranking the richest Venetians of the year. Medieval accountants were many things, but they were not preparing rich lists for curious people 700 years in the future. What we do have are clues. One of the strongest pieces of evidence comes from Marco's own will, written shortly before his death in the year 1324. The document reveals a man who possessed significant wealth even after years of retirement. Marco owned property in Venice. He held valuable goods and investments. He had servants. Most remarkably, he still possessed a Mongol slave named Peter, whom he freed in his will while granting him money and personal belongings. That detail alone hints at substantial resources. Maintaining servants and household staff required steady income. Poor merchants did not casually distribute gifts and property in their final documents. But the greatest source of Marco's wealth likely came from the years spent inside the Mongol Empire. The Polo family operated during one of the most extraordinary periods in commercial history. Under Mongol rule, vast territories from the Mediterranean to China were connected by relatively secure trade routes. Merchants could move goods across thousands of miles with a level of safety that had rarely existed before. Luxury products generated enormous profits. Silks, precious stones, spices, perfumes, fine textiles, ivory, porcelain, and exotic goods all commanded high prices in European markets. A successful merchant dealing in these commodities could earn fortunes that ordinary craftsmen would never see in several lifetimes. Marco's position gave him unique advantages. According to his account, he spent years serving the court of Kublai Khan. Whether every detail is accurate remains debated, but it is clear that the Polos enjoyed privileged access to networks unavailable to most Europeans. They were not merely travellers passing through, they were insiders operating within the richest empire on earth. Yet historians generally agree on one important point. Marco Polo was wealthy, but he was probably not among the richest individuals in Europe. The true financial giants of his era were often merchant banking families, powerful city-states, major princes, and kings. Their resources reached levels that even a successful Venetian trader would struggle to match. Still, that does not mean Marco fell short of the nobles. In fact, when compared to the average aristocrat, the picture becomes much more surprising. The gap between merchants and nobles was not nearly as large as many people imagine. If Marco Polo could not compete with kings, perhaps that is the wrong comparison. After all, most nobles were not kings. The medieval aristocracy resembled a pyramid. At the very top stood a handful of monarchs and great princes who controlled enormous territories. Below them existed thousands of lesser nobles, whose lives were considerably less glamorous than modern movies often suggest. Many knights and minor lords lived comfortably, but not extravagantly. A small noble might own a manor house, a few fields, some livestock, and rights over a nearby village. He enjoyed social prestige and legal privileges, but his actual income could be surprisingly modest. Maintaining horses, weapons, servants, and a respectable household was expensive. Some nobles spent so heavily trying to appear wealthy that they regularly found themselves in debt. Titles did not automatically create riches. This is where successful merchants began to challenge the old order. By the late 13th century, cities like Venice, Genoa, Florence, and Bruges were producing businessmen whose liquid wealth sometimes exceeded that of traditional aristocrats. Unlike nobles, merchants dealt directly in money. They invested, traded, lent capital, and accumulated assets that could grow rapidly. Marco Polo belonged to this emerging world. Although exact figures are impossible to calculate, the evidence suggests that Marco possessed substantial urban wealth. His family owned property, conducted international trade, and maintained connections across continents. The profits generated by successful long-distance commerce could be astonishing. Consider a shipment of luxury silk arriving from Asia. A noble lord might spend years collecting rents from peasants to earn a certain amount of income. A merchant involved in a successful trade expedition could potentially generate comparable profits in a much shorter period. The risks were enormous, but so were the rewards. Venice itself was full of examples. Merchant families built grand residences along canals, financed fleets, and accumulated fortunes that allowed them to live in ways nearly indistinguishable from the nobility. Some even married into aristocratic families, blending commercial wealth with noble status. This would have seemed almost revolutionary to earlier generations. For centuries, land had been the primary source of power. Now money was beginning to compete with birth. Marco Polo stood directly at the centre of that transformation. He was not a duke. He was not a count. He possessed no hereditary kingdom, yet he likely enjoyed greater financial resources than many lesser nobles scattered across Europe. And this raises an even more intriguing possibility. If Marco was wealthier than numerous aristocrats, how did ordinary nobles react when merchants started buying houses, influence, and lifestyles that once belonged exclusively to the noble class? The answer was not always friendly. The rise of wealthy merchants created a problem that medieval Europe had never fully faced before. What happens when a man with no noble title becomes richer than people who possess several? For generations, society had operated on a simple assumption. Nobles ruled because they were born into noble families. Merchants traded. Peasants farmed. Priests prayed. Everyone supposedly knew their place. Reality, however, had other plans. By Marco Polo's lifetime, international trade was producing fortunes on a scale that challenged these traditional boundaries. Merchant families in Venice, Genoa, and Florence were accumulating wealth that could rival long-established aristocratic houses. Money was beginning to buy things that birth alone could not guarantee. A wealthy merchant could build a magnificent residence. He could wear expensive fabrics imported from distant lands. He could sponsor churches, finance ships, and lend money to rulers. In some cases, he could even influence politics more effectively than a local noble. This was especially true in Venice. Unlike many European kingdoms, Venice was governed by a merchant elite. Commercial success carried enormous prestige. The city's leading families built their power through trade networks rather than vast agricultural estates. Marco Polo grew up in this environment. To a Venetian, wealth earned through commerce was not necessarily inferior to wealth inherited through noble blood. A successful merchant was often admired rather than looked down upon. Elsewhere in Europe, attitudes could be very different. Many aristocrats viewed merchants with suspicion. They appreciated luxury goods, certainly. They enjoyed spices, silks, and imported treasures. But the people supplying those goods occupied an uncomfortable position. Merchants were becoming powerful, and power tends to make established elites nervous. There was also a cultural difference between the two groups. Nobles often emphasized lineage. They proudly traced their ancestry back through generations of warriors and landowners. Merchants emphasized success. They cared less about what their grandfather had done and more about what their next shipment might earn. One group inherited status, the other earned it. The tension between these worlds would shape European society for centuries. Marco Polo himself represented a remarkable example of this new reality. He was famous throughout Europe. His travels made him a celebrity long before such a concept formally existed. His connections stretched across continents. His family possessed substantial wealth generated through trade rather than inherited estates. Yet despite all of this, there remained limits. No matter how wealthy Marco became, there were certain princes and rulers whose resources existed on an entirely different scale. To understand where he truly ranked, we must compare his fortune not to ordinary nobles, but to the richest elites of medieval Europe. If Marco Polo was wealthier than many nobles, there was still a ceiling he could not break. At the very top of medieval society stood rulers whose resources were almost impossible for private individuals to match. Take the King of France. During Marco's lifetime, the French crown controlled vast territories, collected taxes from millions of subjects, imposed tolls, managed royal estates, and commanded revenues from some of the most productive agricultural land in Europe. Even when royal finances were strained, and they often were, the king possessed access to resources that dwarfed those of ordinary merchants. The same was true for the kings of England, Aragon, Hungary, and other major realms. These rulers were not simply wealthy individuals. They controlled governments. Their fortunes were tied to entire countries. Then there were the great princes, the dukes of Burgundy, the powerful lords of northern Italy, and various German princes often commanded incomes larger than those of smaller kingdoms. They maintained armies, castles, courts, and networks of officials that required enormous expenditures. Marco Polo could not realistically compete with such figures. No merchant of his era could, but wealth is not always about raw numbers. Many rulers possessed tremendous assets while suffering constant financial difficulties. Wars consumed fortunes. Castles required maintenance. Armies demanded wages. Royal courts devoured money at astonishing speed. A king might technically control greater wealth than a merchant, while simultaneously owing enormous debts. Merchants operated differently. Their fortunes were often smaller on paper, but more flexible. They could invest capital, move money between markets, purchase goods, and respond quickly to opportunities. They were not burdened with financing entire governments. This distinction became increasingly important during the late Middle Ages. In fact, some rulers eventually found themselves borrowing money from merchants and banking families. Imagine the irony. A noble who believed merchants were socially inferior might still need to ask them for loans. History has a wonderful sense of humour. Marco Polo himself was not a banker on the scale of later financial dynasties, but his world was helping create a new economic reality. Wealth was slowly shifting away from being purely about land and titles. Commerce was becoming a source of power in its own right, and while Marco could not rival the treasury of a king, he belonged to a class of merchants that was steadily growing more influential across Europe. The real question, then, is not whether Marco Polo was richer than the greatest princes. He almost certainly was not. The more revealing question is whether his fortune placed him among the economic elite of Europe, and the evidence suggests that it absolutely did. Money was not the only measure of success in Marco Polo's world. There was another form of wealth, one far more difficult to calculate but often just as valuable: reputation. By the time Marco Polo died in the year 1324, he had become one of the most famous travellers in Europe. His book, known today as The Travels of Marco Polo, spread stories of distant kingdoms, vast cities, exotic goods, and immense riches that most Europeans could scarcely imagine. In an age when most people rarely travelled farther than the nearest market town, Marco had crossed continents. That alone made him extraordinary. His descriptions of the court of Kublai Khan fascinated readers for generations. He wrote about paper money, giant cities, efficient postal systems, coal used as fuel, and commercial networks stretching across Asia. Some readers were amazed, others were skeptical. Many simply refused to believe him. Legend claims that even on his deathbed, friends urged him to admit that he had exaggerated his adventures. Marco supposedly replied that he had not told even half of what he had seen. Whether he actually said those words remains uncertain. What is certain is that his stories transformed his reputation, and reputation could be converted into opportunity. Successful merchants relied heavily on trust. Investors wanted reliable partners. Businessmen preferred dealing with people whose names carried weight. A merchant known throughout Europe possessed advantages unavailable to competitors. Marco's fame may have been worth almost as much as some of his property. Imagine two Venetian traders seeking investors. One is a capable but unknown businessman. The other is Marco Polo, the traveller who served at the court of the great Khan and returned from Asia with tales of immense wealth. Which one attracts more attention? The answer is fairly obvious. His reputation also enhanced his family's standing within Venetian society. Wealth opened doors, but fame ensured people noticed when you walked through them. This combination was unusual. Many nobles possessed wealth without fame. Many adventurers gained fame without wealth. Marco managed to acquire both. Yet fame can sometimes distort reality. Over the centuries, Marco Polo's legend grew larger than the man himself. Stories about hidden jewels, fabulous treasures, and unimaginable fortunes became attached to his name. Some later generations imagined him as one of the richest men who ever lived. The historical evidence tells a more measured story. Marco was undoubtedly wealthy and influential. But was he wealthy enough to rank among the greatest fortunes of medieval Europe? To answer that, we must separate the legend from the ledger and examine what historians believe his fortune was actually worth. Trying to calculate Marco Polo's exact wealth is a bit like trying to count coins at the bottom of a fountain after 7 centuries of people tossing in more legends. The records simply are not detailed enough. Unlike some medieval kings and city governments, Marco Polo did not leave behind account books showing every asset he owned. Historians must instead piece together clues from wills, property records, legal documents, and the economic realities of Venice during his lifetime. Even so, a fairly clear picture emerges. Marco Polo was wealthy, not merely comfortable, not simply successful. Wealthy enough to own property, maintain servants, participate in Venice's commercial elite, and leave behind a respectable estate when he died. Yet he was probably not among the richest men in Venice itself. That distinction is important. Venice was one of the wealthiest cities in the world during the late 13th and early 14th centuries. Its greatest merchant families controlled fleets of ships, warehouses full of goods, banking operations, and international trading networks stretching across the Mediterranean. Some fortunes were enormous. The richest Venetian dynasties accumulated wealth across multiple generations. Their resources often exceeded those of regional princes. Compared to these financial giants, Marco appears prosperous, but not exceptional. Think of it this way. If medieval Europe had produced a list of the 100 richest people alive, Marco Polo might have appeared somewhere on it. He probably would not have occupied the top positions. Those spots would likely have belonged to kings, major princes, powerful banking families, and the wealthiest merchant dynasties of Italy. Still, ranking below the richest people in Europe is hardly an insult. Most nobles would have gladly traded places with him. Many aristocrats possessed prestigious titles but relatively modest incomes. A knight with a small estate might enjoy higher social status on paper, yet have fewer financial resources than a successful Venetian merchant. Marco's fortune likely placed him above a large portion of Europe's lesser nobility. His wealth was also unusually liquid. A nobleman's fortune was often trapped in land. Marco's wealth came largely from commerce, investments, luxury goods, and urban property. Such assets could often be converted into opportunities far more quickly than a distant manor house. This is why historians generally reach a balanced conclusion. Marco Polo was not richer than Europe's greatest rulers. He was not richer than Venice's most powerful merchant dynasties, but he was almost certainly richer than a great many European nobles. And that tells us something remarkable about the changing world he lived in. The old aristocratic order was no longer the only path to extraordinary wealth. After comparing merchants, knights, lords, princes, and kings, we can finally answer the question that has followed Marco Polo for centuries. Was Marco Polo richer than most European nobles? The answer is probably yes, but with an important qualification. He was richer than most nobles, not all nobles. The distinction matters because medieval society was extraordinarily unequal. A minor knight struggling to maintain his manor lived in a completely different financial universe from the King of France. Both belonged to the nobility, yet their fortunes were separated by a vast gulf. Marco Polo occupied an unusual position within that world. He was born into a prosperous merchant family, gained access to the commercial networks of the Mongol Empire, returned with significant wealth, owned property in Venice, maintained servants, and left behind a respectable estate. Every surviving piece of evidence points toward a man who enjoyed considerable financial success. Compared to countless lesser nobles scattered across Europe, Marco likely possessed greater wealth. Compared to major dukes, powerful princes and kings, he almost certainly did not. What makes his story remarkable is not that he became richer than every aristocrat. It is that a merchant could compete with aristocrats at all. For much of medieval history, wealth and status had been tied to land. If someone wanted power, they usually needed estates, titles, and noble ancestry. Commerce was often viewed as secondary. Marco Polo lived during the period when that old system was beginning to change. Trade routes connected continents. Cities grew richer. Merchant families accumulated fortunes that rivaled those of ancient noble houses. Gold earned through commerce was starting to challenge wealth inherited through bloodlines. The sun rises over ancient Carthage, and before the city is fully awake, the harbour is already alive. Long before Rome became master of the Mediterranean, Carthage was one of the richest and most powerful cities on earth. From a distance, arriving sailors first see its massive walls glowing in the early morning light. Behind them rises a city of merchants, craftsmen, sailors, priests, nobles, and labourers. Nearly every person is connected in some way to trade, because trade is the lifeblood of Carthage. As dawn spreads across the Bay of Tunis, fishing boats are already returning with their night's catch. Their crews shout to dock workers waiting on the piers. Nearby, larger merchant vessels rock gently on the water after journeys from Sicily, Sardinia, Spain, North Africa, and even lands far beyond the Pillars of Hercules. The smell of the city arrives before its sights. Salt water mixes with smoke from cooking fires. Fresh bread bakes in neighbourhood ovens. Fish, olive oil, spices and damp ropes create a scent that no visitor would ever mistake for anywhere else. You begin your day in Rewrite Chapter 1 and make it 400 words long. Chapter 1. Dawn over the greatest rival of Rome. The sun is just beginning to rise over ancient Carthage, and already the city is awake. Long before Rome ruled the Mediterranean, Carthage stood as one of the richest and most powerful cities in the known world. Built on the coast of North Africa, overlooking the sparkling waters of a vast bay, it was a city where wealth arrived by ship every single day. Merchants spoke dozens of languages, sailors came from distant shores, and goods flowed through its harbours in quantities that would have amazed most ancient cities. As the first light spreads across the sea, the great walls of Carthage emerge from the darkness. The city climbs gently uphill from the waterfront, its whitewashed buildings catching the morning sun. Behind the walls live perhaps hundreds of thousands of people, making Carthage one of the largest urban centres of its age. You begin your day near the harbour district. The air is cool for now, though everyone knows the North African heat will arrive soon enough. Dock workers are already hauling ropes, unloading cargo, and shouting instructions across the piers. Fishing boats return from the night's work, bringing tuna, sardines, and shellfish. Larger merchant vessels sit anchored nearby, their hulls filled with silver from Spain, grain from North Africa, wine from Sicily, timber from distant forests, and luxury goods from lands most citizens will never see. The smell is impossible to ignore. Salt water mixes with fish, olive oil, wood smoke, and freshly baked bread. Somewhere nearby, a baker is pulling warm loaves from a clay oven. Sailors finishing a night shift eagerly form a line. Few things unite humanity across history quite like the desire for breakfast. As the city brightens, the streets begin to fill. Merchants open wooden shutters covering their shops. Apprentices sweep doorways clean. Donkeys loaded with baskets move toward the markets. Wealthy citizens emerge from spacious homes, while labourers hurry toward workshops where long days await them. Unlike Rome, Carthage is fundamentally a city of commerce. Nearly everything revolves around trade. Success here is measured not by conquered territory, but by profitable voyages. The city's elite are often merchants whose fortunes have been built through shipping, investments, and commercial partnerships spanning the Mediterranean. This focus on trade has made Carthage incredibly wealthy, but it has also made it ambitious. As the sun rises higher above the harbour, another ordinary day begins in the city. Yet beneath the sounds of business and daily life lies the confidence of a civilization that believes its future is as vast as the sea itself. As the morning sun climbs higher over Carthage, the city's markets begin to reach full speed. If the harbour is the heart of Carthage, the marketplace is its pulse. Every road seems to lead here. Merchants arrive pushing carts, carrying baskets, or leading donkeys loaded with goods. Buyers crowd the streets, bargaining over prices with an enthusiasm that occasionally suggests they are negotiating the fate of nations rather than the cost of a fish. The noise is constant. Voices overlap in Punic, Greek, Libyan dialects and other languages brought by traders from across the Mediterranean. Somewhere a merchant is praising the quality of his olive oil. Nearby, a customer is insisting that the olive oil was undoubtedly better yesterday. Some things never change. You move through narrow streets lined with stalls and permanent shops. Unlike many smaller ancient towns, Carthage's markets are supplied by an enormous commercial network. Goods arrive from nearly every corner of the known world. Spanish silver gleams in display cases. Ivory from Africa sits beside carved jewellery. Fine fabrics imported from the eastern Mediterranean hang from wooden racks. Large jars of wine wait to be sold, while sacks of grain stand stacked in neat rows. Exotic spices command high prices, their scents drifting through the air and mixing with the smell of fresh fruit and roasting meat. The wealth of Carthage is visible everywhere. A merchant from Sicily negotiates with a ship captain from Sardinia. A local craftsman purchases imported copper. Wealthy households send servants to buy supplies for the day. Every transaction adds another thread to the vast web of trade that has made Carthage powerful. Yet not everyone here is rich. Labourers search for work. Farmers who have travelled from the countryside hope to sell their produce before returning home. Apprentices carry heavy loads for masters who seem remarkably skilled at pointing toward objects they have no intention of lifting themselves. For many citizens, the market is more than a place of business. It is also a source of news. Stories spread quickly here. Reports arrive from distant colonies. Rumours about political decisions circulate through the crowd. News of wars, storms, successful voyages, and failed expeditions travels from mouth to mouth faster than any official announcement. A person could spend hours here and learn more about the Mediterranean than many kings. As midday approaches, the crowds grow even larger. The wealth flowing through these streets explains why Carthage became one of the most prosperous cities of the ancient world. But commerce alone does not build a great city. Behind the markets, another world is hard at work, the workshops where Carthaginian craftsmen transform raw materials into goods sought across the Mediterranean. Leaving the crowded marketplace behind, you follow the sounds of hammering, sawing, grinding, and shouting into one of the busiest parts of the city. This is the world of Carthage's craftsmen. While merchants often receive most of the glory, they could not build fortunes without the thousands of workers who transformed raw materials into valuable goods. Across the city, workshops operate from sunrise to sunset, producing everything from pottery and jewellery to ships and weapons. The streets here are narrower than those near the harbour. Buildings stand close together, their lower floors serving as workshops while families often live above them. The air is thick with smoke, dust and the smell of heated metal. Every few steps, a different trade announces itself through sound alone. A blacksmith's hammer rings against an anvil, a carpenter cuts timber for furniture, a potter shapes wet clay on a spinning wheel. The city feels less polished here, but no less important. You stop near a bronze workshop, where craftsmen carefully cast tools, lamps, and decorative items. Bronze remains one of the most valuable materials in everyday life. Wealthy households purchase finely crafted pieces, while merchants export others to distant markets. Nearby, jewelers work with silver and gold imported from Spain. Their hands move with astonishing precision as they shape necklaces, rings, and decorative ornaments. One mistake could destroy hours of labour. Further along, textile workers spin wool and weave fabrics. The process is slow and repetitive, yet clothing represents a major industry. Fine garments are symbols of status throughout the Mediterranean, and wealthy Carthaginians are more than willing to spend money ensuring their neighbours understand exactly how successful they are. Some traditions never disappear. The largest workshops, however, are connected to shipbuilding. Carthage's power depends upon the sea. Its merchant fleet and navy require constant maintenance. Timber arrives from overseas forests and is transformed into vessels that will cross thousands of miles of water. The scale is impressive. Dozens of labourers work together shaping planks, fitting beams, and preparing ships for future voyages. Every completed vessel represents future profits, future trade, and perhaps future military power. For ordinary workers, life here is demanding. The hours are long, the labour is physical, and accidents are common. Yet these workshops form the foundation of Carthage's prosperity. As afternoon approaches, the craftsmen continue their work while another side of the city begins to emerge. Beyond the workshops stand the elegant homes of Carthage's wealthy elite, where the fortunes created by trade are put on full display. Leaving behind the noise of the workshops, you begin climbing toward one of Carthage's more prosperous neighbourhoods. The change is immediate. The crowded streets filled with labourers and craftsmen gradually give way to cleaner avenues lined with larger homes. The smells of smoke and metal fade, replaced by gardens, flowers, and the faint scent of incense drifting from open courtyards. This is where Carthage's wealth lives. The city's most successful merchants, ship owners, officials, and influential families occupy spacious residences that reflect the prosperity generated by centuries of trade. While many ancient cities reserved their finest homes for hereditary nobles, Carthage often rewarded commercial success. A man who managed a profitable trading empire could enjoy a lifestyle that rivaled aristocrats anywhere in the Mediterranean. You approach one of these grand homes. From the street, the exterior appears surprisingly plain. Like many ancient houses, the wealth is hidden inside rather than displayed outwardly. Thick walls provide privacy and protection from the heat. Passing through the entrance, however, reveals a very different world. A central courtyard lies at the heart of the house. Sunlight pours down from above, illuminating decorative stonework and carefully maintained plants. A small fountain provides both beauty and cooling moisture during the hot summer months. Rooms branch outward from the courtyard. Storage rooms contain imported goods and household supplies. Reception rooms allow owners to entertain guests and discuss business. Private family quarters offer comfort that most citizens can only dream about. The floors may be decorated with colourful mosaics. Walls are painted in bright colours. Fine furniture fills the rooms. Expensive fabrics hang from doorways and windows. Every detail quietly communicates status. The household itself operates almost like a small business. Servants prepare meals, clean rooms, manage supplies, and assist visitors. Family members oversee investments, trading ventures, and commercial partnerships. Wealth in Carthage is rarely passive. Successful merchants constantly seek new opportunities, new routes, and new profits. Meals are often impressive affairs. Fish, olives, fruits, vegetables, bread, wine, and imported delicacies appear on the table. Guests discuss politics, trade, and news from distant ports. A successful voyage can become the topic of conversation for weeks. Yet even among the wealthy, there is an awareness that fortune depends on the sea. Storms, pirates, wars, and failed expeditions can erase years of profits. Perhaps that is why Carthaginians remain so focused on commerce. As the afternoon continues, many wealthy citizens turn their attention toward the city's most remarkable feature of all, the enormous harbour system that made Carthage a Mediterranean superpower. If there is one place that truly explains the power of Carthage, it is here. The harbour. As the afternoon sun glitters across the water, you arrive at one of the most extraordinary engineering achievements of the ancient world. Visitors from distant lands often leave impressed by Carthage's markets, homes, and wealth. But the harbour leaves them speechless. Everything begins here. Trade, naval power, diplomacy, and communication all flow through these waters. Without the harbour, Carthage would simply be another prosperous coastal city. With it, the city becomes the centre of a maritime empire stretching across the Mediterranean. The outer harbour is a scene of constant activity. Merchant ships arrive and depart throughout the day. Their sails bear the colours and symbols of ports scattered across the known world. Crews unload grain from North Africa, silver from Iberia, wine from Sicily, timber from distant forests, and luxury goods from eastern markets. Dock workers swarm over the piers. Crates are lifted onto carts. Cargo is inspected and recorded. Merchants negotiate contracts while sailors repair ropes and sails worn by weeks at sea. The entire harbour functions like a giant machine. Every worker has a role. Every ship has a destination. Every delay means lost money. But the most remarkable feature lies beyond the commercial docks. Hidden behind protective walls is the famous military harbour, known today as the Carthage. Unlike the busy merchant harbour, this area is carefully organised. The basin is circular, a design that astonishes many visitors. Around its edges stand covered ship sheds, where warships can be stored, repaired, and protected from the elements. At the centre rises an island structure used by naval commanders. From here, officials can oversee operations and monitor activity throughout the harbour. The site is impressive enough to make rivals nervous, which is exactly the point. Carthage's wealth depends on trade, but trade requires protection. Pirates, hostile cities, and ambitious kingdoms all threaten commercial routes. The navy exists to ensure that merchant vessels continue arriving safely with their valuable cargoes. For many citizens, the harbour represents opportunity. A young sailor might find work on a merchant ship. A merchant may discover a profitable new route. An ambitious captain could build a fortune through successful voyages. The sea offers risks, certainly. Storms sink ships. Pirates attack convoys. Entire cargoes disappear without warning. Yet the rewards are immense. As the afternoon begins to fade, ships continue moving across the harbour like pieces on a giant game board, and while wealth arrives by sea, another force quietly shapes daily life in Carthage, the temples, priests, and religious traditions that guide the city's spiritual world. As the afternoon heat begins to soften, the pace of the city changes. The markets remain busy. Ships still enter the harbour. Workshops continue their work. Yet above the sounds of trade and industry, rises another presence that touches every part of Carthaginian life: religion. To understand ancient Carthage, you must understand that the gods are everywhere. Their temples overlook busy streets. Their symbols decorate homes and workshops. Their blessings are sought before voyages, business deals, marriages, and military campaigns. For many citizens, the success of the city itself depends upon maintaining a proper relationship with divine powers. You follow a broad street toward one of Carthage's major temple districts. The buildings stand taller and more imposing than those around them. Stone columns frame large entrances. Incense drifts through the air. Worshippers move steadily in and out, carrying offerings ranging from simple food items to expensive gifts donated by wealthy families. The most important deities include Baal Hammon, often regarded as a powerful father figure associated with fertility and prosperity, and Tanit, one of the city's most beloved goddesses. Her symbol appears throughout Carthage. Citizens wear it as jewellery, merchants place it in their homes, sailors carry it aboard ships hoping for protection during dangerous voyages. Inside the temple precincts, priests oversee rituals that have been practiced for generations. Some worshippers arrive seeking guidance. Others offer thanks for successful business ventures. A merchant whose ship has safely returned from Spain may donate part of his profits. A family celebrating a marriage may bring gifts. A sailor preparing for a long voyage might pray for favourable winds and calm seas. Religion and commerce often intertwine. Successful traders thank the gods for their profits. Wealthy families sponsor religious ceremonies. Temples themselves sometimes become important landowners and economic institutions. The atmosphere is surprisingly orderly. Contrary to popular imagination, most religious activity involves routine ceremonies, prayers, festivals, and community gatherings. For ordinary citizens, religion is not an occasional event, but a regular part of daily life. Children learn traditions from their parents. Families attend festivals together. Public ceremonies bring entire neighbourhoods into the streets. As the day moves toward evening, shadows stretch across temple courtyards. The heat finally begins to fade. Citizens finish their prayers and return to their homes. But Carthage is not preparing to sleep. The city's busiest hours may be ending. Yet another side of urban life is about to emerge. Families gather for meals, streets fill with conversation, and homes across the city come alive as evening settles over the great rival of Rome. As the sun sinks toward the horizon and the worst of the day's heat finally releases its grip on the city, Carthage begins to slow down. Not stop, just slow. The harbour remains active, and some workshops continue operating, but for many citizens, evening is the most welcome part of the day. After hours of labour, bargaining, sailing, and managing businesses, families begin gathering behind the walls of their homes. The streets take on a different character. Children who spent the day helping parents or running errands now play in courtyards and alleys. Neighbours stop to exchange news. Merchants finally close their shops and count the day's earnings. The sounds of commerce gradually give way to the sounds of conversation. Across the city, fires are lit for the evening meal. The smell of cooking soon drifts through entire neighbourhoods. Bread appears on nearly every table. Olive oil remains a staple of daily life. Families enjoy vegetables, fruits, legumes and fish brought in from the coast. Wealthier households may serve larger quantities of meat, imported delicacies, and expensive wines. For ordinary citizens, however, even a simple meal is an important social event. Ancient life can be exhausting. Most work is done by human or animal muscle. There are no engines, no electric lights, and certainly no machines willing to do unpleasant tasks on your behalf. After a long day, sitting down with family is one of life's greatest comforts. Inside a prosperous Carthaginian home, guests may be invited to dine. Business discussions often continue during meals. Trade agreements are explored. News from foreign ports is shared. Stories from recent voyages are repeated, sometimes becoming slightly more impressive with each retelling. A sailor who survived rough seas in the morning may have battled sea monsters by dessert. This is a universal human tradition. Meanwhile, in more modest homes, families gather in smaller rooms around simple dishes. Parents discuss work. Children listen to stories. Elderly relatives pass along memories of past events, victories, and hardships. These moments help hold the city together. For all its wealth and maritime power, Carthage is ultimately a collection of households, each following familiar routines that have existed for generations. As darkness slowly approaches, lamps are lit throughout the city. Their warm glow appears in windows, courtyards, and doorways. From a distance, Carthage begins to sparkle against the fading sky. And as night settles over the city, one final transformation awaits. The daytime crowds disappear, and the streets reveal an entirely different face after dark. Night falls slowly over Carthage. The last rays of sunlight disappear beyond the western horizon, and the city enters a different rhythm. The harbour becomes quieter. Market stalls close. Workshops finally fall silent after a long day of labour. Yet Carthage does not sleep immediately. Thousands of oil lamps flicker to life across the city. Their golden glow spills from windows, courtyards, temples and taverns, transforming familiar streets into something entirely new. The noise of commerce fades, replaced by softer sounds, conversations, distant music, barking dogs, and the occasional laughter drifting through the darkness. Walking through Carthage at night feels very different from moving through it during the day. The crowds have thinned considerably. Many citizens remain at home with their families, but others take advantage of the cooler evening air. Friends gather in courtyards. Neighbours sit outside their homes discussing politics, trade, or local gossip. In a city where information is valuable, gossip is often treated as a public service. Near the harbour, taverns remain busy. Sailors who have spent weeks at sea finally enjoy a warm meal and strong drink. Merchant captains discuss future voyages. Dock workers celebrate the end of another exhausting day. Stories flow as freely as the wine. Some are true, others become increasingly heroic after the second cup. A sailor who encountered rough weather may describe surviving a storm powerful enough to challenge the gods themselves. By the end of the evening, listeners may wonder how the ship survived being struck by lightning, attacked by pirates, and swallowed by a sea monster, all on the same voyage. The city guards continue their patrols. Security remains important in a wealthy port city. Valuable cargoes sit in warehouses. Merchant fortunes rest behind locked doors. Patrols move through the streets, carrying lamps and watching for trouble. Most nights are peaceful. Carthage thrives because stability encourages trade. Merchants prefer conducting business in cities where their goods are unlikely to disappear overnight. Far above the streets, the stars shine brightly. Without modern lights, the night sky appears astonishingly clear. Sailors study familiar constellations that guide ships across the Mediterranean. Priests observe heavenly movements. Ordinary citizens pause to admire a view that every generation before them has shared. Eventually, even the taverns begin to empty. The lamps burn lower. Families settle into sleep. Tomorrow the harbour will awaken again before sunrise, and the great machine of Carthaginian commerce will begin another day. But before dawn arrives, there is one final place worth visiting, the heart of Carthage's power itself, where the city's leaders make decisions that shape an empire. Before dawn arrives and another day begins, there is one final side of Carthage worth exploring. Every Roman legionary began his military career in exactly the same way. Not on a battlefield, not with a shield, not while charging heroically toward an enemy. He began with a decision. Somewhere in the vast Roman Empire, a young man looked at his future and chose the army. For many, it was one of the most important decisions they would ever make. Imagine yourself in Roman Italy during the reign of an emperor like Augustus, Trajan, or Hadrian. You are a young citizen, perhaps in your late teens or early 20s. Your family might own a small farm. Perhaps you work in a workshop. Maybe you live in a crowded apartment building in Rome itself, surrounded by noise, smoke, and neighbours who somehow manage to argue before sunrise every morning. Life is not necessarily miserable, but opportunities are limited. Land is expensive. Good jobs are competitive. Wealth is concentrated in the hands of a relatively small number of people. Many young men spend their lives following the same routine as their fathers and grandfathers. The army offers something different. It offers adventure, at least in theory. It offers regular pay, which sounds considerably more attractive when your current income depends on whether it rains at the correct time. It offers food, clothing, equipment, and a place within one of the most respected institutions in the Roman world. Most importantly, it offers a future. A successful legionary can earn bonuses, gain valuable experience, and eventually retire with rewards that might transform his social position. Veterans are often granted land or financial settlements. Many leave the army in a better position than when they entered. Of course, recruiters tend to emphasize these advantages. They spend less time discussing long marches in terrible weather, carrying heavy equipment across mountains, or being stationed hundreds of miles from home. Every profession has its marketing department. Still, the appeal is real. The Roman army is admired throughout the empire. Legionaries are symbols of Roman power. They build roads, guard frontiers, construct forts, and conquer territories. Wherever Rome expands, the legions are usually at the center of the story. For a young citizen seeking purpose, status, or financial security, the attraction is obvious. Yet wanting to become a legionary and actually becoming one are very different things. The Roman army does not simply accept everyone who arrives. Before a recruit can wear the famous red tunic, carry a shield, or call himself a soldier of Rome, he must first prove that he is worthy of joining the most formidable military machine in the ancient world. Wanting to join the legion is the easy part. Now comes the difficult part. The Roman army has little interest in dreams, ambitions, or impressive stories told in taverns. Recruiters care about one thing above all else: whether you can become a useful soldier. You arrive at a recruitment station along with dozens of other young men. Some look confident, some look nervous. A few are trying very hard to appear confident while looking nervous. Human nature has not changed much in 2,000 years. The recruiting officers begin with the basics. First comes citizenship. For much of the imperial period, service in the legions is reserved primarily for Roman citizens. This immediately separates the legions from the auxiliary forces, which recruit many non-citizens from across the empire. Being a Roman citizen is more than a legal status. It is a ticket into one of the most respected military organizations in the ancient world. Next comes the physical examination. The Roman army prefers strong recruits. Height requirements vary throughout history, but officers generally favor men who appear healthy, sturdy, and capable of enduring hardship. No one is looking for a champion athlete. They are looking for endurance. Can you march all day carrying heavy equipment? Can you dig defensive ditches after marching all day? Can you still follow orders after digging those ditches? These are the questions that matter. Ancient writers occasionally describe recruiters examining teeth, posture, eyesight, and overall fitness. The army is making a long-term investment. Training a legionary takes time and money, and Rome prefers not to discover halfway through training that a recruit becomes exhausted by the ambitious physical challenge of walking uphill. Character matters as well. Officers want disciplined men. The army functions because thousands of soldiers obey commands instantly. A recruit known for laziness, criminal behaviour, or constant troublemaking may find his military career ending before it begins. Not every applicant succeeds. Some are rejected for health reasons. Others fail to meet standards. A few simply realise that military life sounds considerably less glamorous when standing face to face with the people who actually live it. Those who pass, however, move forward. Their names are recorded. Documents are prepared. The process becomes official. For the first time, the possibility of becoming a legionary feels real. Yet one crucial step still remains. Before Rome entrusts a man with weapons, armour, and responsibility, he must swear an oath unlike any other. And once that oath is spoken, there is no turning back. After passing the inspections and proving that you meet the army's requirements, you arrive at the moment that truly transforms you from a civilian into a recruit: the oath. To modern eyes, it may seem like a formality. To the Romans, it is anything but. The Roman army is built upon discipline, loyalty, and obedience. Thousands of men must act as a single unit. They must march together, build together, fight together, and sometimes die together. An oath helps make that possible. You stand alongside other recruits, perhaps in a fort courtyard or military camp. Some men are excited. Others are anxious. Most are probably wondering whether they have made the right decision. Unfortunately, Rome does not offer a trial period. Once the oath is sworn, military life becomes your life. The oath, known as the sacramentum, is a solemn promise made before witnesses and the gods. By speaking its words, a recruit agrees to obey lawful orders, serve faithfully, and never abandon his duty. This is not merely a contract, it is a sacred obligation. Romans take oaths very seriously. Breaking one is considered both a legal offence and a moral failure. A soldier who betrays his oath is not simply disappointing his commander. He is violating a commitment that carries religious significance. The consequences can be severe. Military discipline in the Roman army is famously strict. Punishments range from loss of pay and public humiliation to far harsher penalties. Rome believes that an army survives only when discipline survives. The oath reflects that belief. As each recruit repeats the words, something changes. Yesterday, you were a civilian with choices. Today, you belong to the army. Your future assignments, your daily routine, your place of residence, and even your chances of survival now depend largely upon military service. For some recruits, this realization is thrilling. For others, it is slightly terrifying. Both reactions are understandable. The ceremony often concludes with administrative tasks and assignments. Recruits are officially entered into military records. Officers begin organizing them for training. The Roman military loves paperwork almost as much as it loves marching. Perhaps that combination explains how Rome managed to control such a vast empire. As evening approaches, the newly sworn recruits find themselves surrounded by strangers who will soon become comrades. They come from different towns, different families, and different backgrounds. Yet they now share the same oath, the same responsibilities, and soon, the same hardships. Because swearing loyalty to Rome is the easy part. The next challenge is surviving the training that turns ordinary recruits into legionaries. The oath is over. The excitement is over. Now the real work begins. Many recruits arrive imagining battle. They picture themselves standing in formation, shields gleaming in the sunlight while crowds cheer their victories. The Roman army has a different priority. Before teaching you how to fight an enemy, it first teaches you how to survive being a recruit. The training begins almost immediately. From the moment you wake up, every hour is structured. Officers and instructors have little patience for laziness. A recruit is expected to learn quickly, move quickly, and obey quickly. The Roman army is not trying to create heroes. It is trying to create dependable soldiers. The first shock for many recruits is the marching. Roman armies are famous for their ability to move long distances at remarkable speed. To achieve this, recruits spend countless hours marching under the weight of their equipment. And there is a lot of equipment. A legionary carries weapons, armour, tools, cooking supplies, personal belongings, and various pieces of military gear. The total weight can be substantial. At the end of a long march, you might assume the day's work is finished. You would be mistaken. The Romans believe that a soldier who can march but cannot build is only half trained. So after marching, recruits often dig. Defensive ditches, training trenches, camp fortifications. The Roman army constructs fortified camps with astonishing regularity. Every evening on campaign, soldiers may be expected to help create temporary defences before they can rest. It is difficult work, especially after carrying heavy equipment for miles. The instructors seem entirely unconcerned by this fact. Physical conditioning continues throughout the day. Running, jumping, swimming where possible, strength exercises, endurance drills. Everything is designed to prepare recruits for the realities of military life. Many discover muscles they did not know existed. Those muscles quickly inform them of their existence. Yet beneath the exhaustion, something important is happening. The recruits are changing. Men from different towns and backgrounds begin sharing the same hardships. They eat together, march together, complain together, and gradually develop the bonds that hold armies together. The process is deliberate. Rome understands that discipline is not created overnight. It is built one difficult day at a time. And while marching and digging are exhausting, they are only the beginning. The most famous part of Roman military training still lies ahead. Soon the recruits will pick up practice weapons and learn how the legions became the most feared fighting force in the ancient world. After days of marching, digging, and physical conditioning, recruits finally reach the part of training they have been waiting for: weapons practice. Most imagine this will be the exciting part. Most are correct. Most are also about to discover that it is exhausting. Roman instructors begin with a simple principle: a soldier should train harder than he will fight. To achieve this, recruits are often given wooden practice swords and wicker shields that are deliberately heavier than the real versions they will eventually carry. The logic is brutal, but effective. If you can fight with equipment heavier than the real thing, actual combat feels easier by comparison. At least that is the theory. The recruits sweating under the afternoon sun may have a different opinion. Training posts are driven into the ground throughout the camp. Each recruit is assigned one and ordered to attack it repeatedly, hour after hour, day after day. The wooden post becomes your enemy. You strike, thrust, step forward, step back, raise your shield, repeat, then repeat again and again. Roman instructors are obsessed with technique. Unlike many warriors of the ancient world, legionaries are taught not to rely on wild swings and dramatic displays of strength. A powerful slash might look impressive, but it exposes the body and consumes energy. The preferred attack is the thrust. Short, direct, efficient. A thrust requires less movement and can be delivered while remaining protected behind a shield. It is not glamorous. It is simply effective, which is a phrase that describes much of Roman military thinking. Recruits also learn formation fighting. The strength of a legion does not come from individual heroics. It comes from hundreds of soldiers moving together as a coordinated unit. A man who charges ahead, seeking glory, can endanger everyone around him. A soldier who maintains formation helps keep the entire line alive. This lesson is repeated constantly. The legion is more important than the individual. The shield wall is more important than personal pride. The army wins through discipline, not drama. Not every recruit adapts immediately. Some struggle with the physical demands. Others find the endless repetition frustrating. Yet week by week, improvement becomes visible. Movements become smoother. Formations become tighter. Confidence begins to replace uncertainty. For the first time, the recruits start to resemble soldiers. But training with wooden weapons inside a safe camp is one thing. Living like a legionary every day is something else entirely. The next lesson Rome teaches is that military life continues long after the training field is empty. A legionary's real home is not a battlefield, it is the camp. By now, the recruit is learning an important truth about the Roman army. Battles are rare. Military life is constant. Most legionaries spend far more time inside camps than on battlefields. In fact, a Roman soldier could serve for years without participating in a major battle. This does not mean his life is easy. Quite the opposite. The Roman camp is a world of rules. Everything has its place. Every street follows a plan. Every tent occupies a designated location. Every unit knows exactly where it belongs. Whether the camp is temporary or permanent, order is everywhere. To Roman commanders, a well-organized camp is almost as important as a well-organized army. For a new recruit, daily life quickly becomes predictable. A trumpet sounds before sunrise. The soldiers wake. Equipment is checked. Breakfast is eaten. Orders are distributed. The day begins. The army values routine because routine creates discipline. When thousands of men know exactly what they are supposed to do, confusion becomes less likely. At least that is the goal. Reality sometimes has other ideas. Recruits spend their days performing countless duties. Weapons must be cleaned. Armor must be maintained. Supplies must be inventoried. Roads and fortifications often require construction. The Roman army is famous not only for fighting but also for building. Legionaries construct roads, bridges, watchtowers, walls, forts, and defensive works throughout the empire. A soldier may spend the morning carrying stones and the afternoon practicing combat. Rome sees no contradiction in this. A useful soldier is expected to do both. The camp also introduces recruits to military hierarchy. Centurions command respect. These experienced officers are responsible for training, discipline, and leadership. Many possess decades of military experience and little patience for excuses. A recruit quickly learns that disappointing a centurion is an experience best avoided. Friendships begin forming as well. The men who marched together, trained together, and suffered through the same hardships now share tents, meals, and responsibilities. These relationships become one of the strongest foundations of legionary life. A soldier does not simply fight for Rome. He fights for the men standing beside him. As weeks pass, the camp begins to feel less like a temporary assignment and more like a home. The routines become familiar. The equipment feels natural. The recruit is no longer completely overwhelmed. Yet there is still one final challenge before he can truly call himself a legionary. Training must be tested. Soon, the recruits will face inspections, evaluations, and demonstrations designed to prove whether they are ready to join the ranks of Rome's professional army. Weeks have passed since the day you swore your oath. The blistered feet have mostly healed. The endless marches no longer seem impossible. The wooden training sword feels less like a burden and more like an extension of your arm. Without fully realizing it, you have changed. Now comes the moment when Rome decides whether that change is enough. The recruit's training is approaching its conclusion. This does not mean there is a final written examination waiting somewhere. The Roman army has little interest in asking multiple-choice questions about shield formations. Instead, it evaluates recruits the Roman way, by watching them work. Every march, every drill, every formation exercise, and every task performed inside the camp contributes to a recruit's reputation. Officers are constantly observing. Can he follow orders? Can he maintain discipline? Can he endure hardship without falling behind? Can he be trusted when things become difficult? These questions matter far more than raw strength. Many men can swing a sword. Far fewer can remain dependable after weeks of exhaustion. Training exercises become increasingly demanding. Recruits march greater distances carrying full equipment. They practice formation maneuvers repeatedly until movements become automatic. Mock battles test coordination and discipline under pressure. Mistakes are corrected immediately, sometimes loudly. Roman instructors are not famous for their gentle encouragement. A centurion's preferred motivational technique often involves pointing out errors in a manner that ensures the entire camp becomes aware of them. The approach may lack subtlety. It is also remarkably effective. As evaluations continue, the recruits begin comparing themselves to one another. Some emerge as natural leaders. Others distinguish themselves through endurance, reliability, or skill with weapons. A few discover that military life is far more demanding than they anticipated. Not everyone thrives, yet most improve. That is precisely what the training system is designed to achieve. Rome does not expect perfect soldiers on the first day. It expects recruits willing to learn. Eventually, the officers reach their conclusions. The men who have met the required standards are accepted into the legion as full soldiers. It is a significant milestone. Months earlier, they arrived as civilians with uncertain futures. Now they stand as members of the most respected military force in the ancient world. There is pride in that achievement. But there is also reality. Training may be ending, yet military life is only beginning. The new legionaries will soon receive assignments. Some will remain close to Italy. Others may find themselves travelling to distant frontiers they have only heard about in stories. And that journey into the wider empire is where the true adventure begins. For generations of Roman recruits, one question hangs in the air as training comes to an end. Where am I going? The answer could change the course of a man's entire life. The Roman Empire stretches across 3 continents. Its borders touch deserts, mountains, dense forests, and distant coastlines. Somewhere along those frontiers stand dozens of legions guarding Rome's interests. And now, new soldiers are needed to fill their ranks. The assignment orders arrive. Some legionaries are fortunate enough to remain relatively close to home. Others receive destinations they have never seen and can barely pronounce. A young recruit from central Italy might suddenly find himself preparing for service along the Rhine frontier, facing the forests of Germania. Another may be sent to Britain, where cold rain and mud seem to have formed a permanent alliance against human happiness. Others head toward the Danube, North Africa, Syria, or other distant regions of the empire. For many recruits, this is their first journey beyond their local area. The empire suddenly becomes very real. The names they learned during childhood are no longer places on a map. They are destinations. The movement of troops is an impressive operation. Groups of soldiers march along Roman roads that connect nearly every corner of the empire. Supply wagons accompany them. Officers organize routes and schedules. Way stations provide food and shelter during the journey. Rome's logistical system is one of the reasons its armies remain so effective. Moving thousands of men across vast distances requires planning, discipline, and organization. Fortunately, those happen to be Rome's favorite hobbies. The journey itself becomes another stage of training. Legionaries march for days or weeks, carrying equipment while adapting to the realities of military travel. Along the way, they encounter other soldiers, merchants, local populations, and travelers from every corner of the empire. For many, it is an eye-opening experience. The world is far larger than they imagined. Eventually, the destination appears. Perhaps it is a massive fortress overlooking the Rhine. Perhaps it is a stone fort perched on a British hilltop. Perhaps it is a desert outpost standing beneath a relentless sun. Whatever the location, one thing becomes immediately clear. The recruit is no longer a recruit. He has arrived at an operational legion. Around him are experienced veterans who have spent years on the frontier. They have survived campaigns, endured harsh winters, and mastered military life. And they are about to evaluate the newcomers with the same skepticism that older soldiers have shown toward recruits since the beginning of military history. The final step in becoming a true legionary is not passing training. It is earning the respect of the men who have already done it. The first days with an active legion are some of the most important in a soldier's career. Not because of a battle, not because of a promotion, but because this is where theory finally meets reality. Training camps are controlled environments. Mistakes are expected. Instructors are watching. Lessons are repeated until everyone understands them. A frontier legion is different. Here, every man has a job to perform. The veterans around you have spent years serving Rome. Some have marched across provinces you have never visited. Others bear scars from campaigns fought before you ever considered joining the army. They can immediately recognize a newcomer. The polished equipment gives him away. So does the expression. Every army in history has had recruits who believe they are fully prepared. Every army in history has also had veterans who find this belief extremely amusing. At first, the new legionary spends much of his time learning from experienced soldiers. Military life does not stop after formal training ends. There are new routines to master, new officers to impress, and countless practical skills that only experience can teach. How do you maintain equipment during a freezing winter? How do you recognize trouble along a frontier? How do you prepare for a long patrol? These lessons are often learned from older soldiers rather than instructors. Gradually, the newcomer becomes part of the unit. He joins guard duty. He participates in construction projects. He patrols roads and fortifications. He stands watch on cold nights while wondering why danger always seems to appear during someone else's shift. The veterans, meanwhile, begin paying closer attention. Can he be trusted? Does he complain constantly? Will he do his share of the work? Can he remain calm under pressure? Respect in the Roman army is rarely given freely. It is earned. One reliable soldier can be worth more than 10 boastful ones. Eventually, something changes. The recruit who once felt out of place starts feeling at home. The camp becomes familiar. The routines become normal. The heavy equipment no longer feels impossibly heavy. The legion itself becomes a second family. Without noticing the exact moment it happens, he stops thinking of himself as a newcomer. He is simply another soldier. And that is precisely what Rome wanted from the beginning. The transformation is complete. A young citizen arrived hoping to become a legionary. He endured inspections, swore an oath, survived training, marched across the empire, and earned his place among veterans. Now he stands in formation, shield at his side, part of the military machine that built and defended the Roman world. Not a recruit, not a trainee, a legionary of Rome.